Chapter 1. Murder at the Mayfair Flower Show. The village of Mayfair in the Dell was the kind of place one might imagine stepping into from the pages of a beloved storybook. Crooked, thatched cottages leaning companionably along winding lanes, a cobbled high street framed with neat shop fronts, a church spire rising tidily above the cluster of rooftops, and hedgerows so thick with blossom that they seemed almost to hum with life. In such a place, life was predictable, comfortable, and to an outsider's eye, perfectly uneventful. It was precisely the sort of place where Miss Jane Marple, now quietly retired from her more active days, found herself perfectly at home. Not that Miss Marple ever truly retired. No, she simply observed with that gentle, penetrating gaze of hers, taking in the minute dramas of human nature as others might take in the weather. And today there was much to observe. The annual Mayfair Flower Show was the village's pride, held each year on the broad, grassy expanse of the vicarage garden. It drew not only every soul from Mayfair in the Dell, but also from neighbouring villages, Barton Hill, East Charmouth, Lower Bentley. There were competitions for best rose, finest, vegetable display, most artistic arrangement, and even a children's category that produced rather alarming towers of marigolds and sweet peas balanced precariously atop one another. The weather had been merciful. A week of soft sunshine had coaxed out the blooms into a riotous blaze of colour. Fat pink peonies, snowy hydrangeas, the golden glow of marigolds. Against this cheerful backdrop, the villagers paraded in their best frocks and straw hats, and the air was thick with the scent of grass, lemonade, and friendly rivalry. Miss Marple, dressed in her neat dove-grey suit and a modest hat trimmed with faded blue ribbons, sat beneath a large oak. A cup of tea balanced delicately in her gloved hand. Beside her, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Symes, bustled about arranging prizes on a trestle table. Gleaming silver cups, embossed certificates, and small envelopes containing modest cash prizes. Miss Marple watched it all with mild amusement, her sharp blue eyes twinkling. It was at such village gatherings, she often thought, that one saw true human nature revealed. Ambition in the form of a perfectly groomed dahlia, envy disguised as admiration over a rival's tomatoes, pride swelling visibly beneath the starch of Sunday-best shirts. Her gaze wandered. There was Major Prescott, boasting loudly over the superior thickness of his runner beans. There was Miss Amelia Hornbeam, fluttering anxiously over her lavender display, darting suspicious glances at Mrs. Simmons, whose own lavender seemed suspiciously lush. Near the rose tent, Molly Drew, a shy, delicate creature, stood biting her lip beside her modest pot of thyme and marjoram. And presiding over it all, like a rotund, self-satisfied sun, about which the villagers orbited, was Mr. Leonard Blackwood, chairman of the Flower Show Committee. Leonard Blackwood was a large man with large opinions. In Mayfair in the Dell, his word was law, or so he liked to believe. His judgments were final, his criticisms unyielding, and his approval, when given, was bestowed with the gravity of a monarch granting a boon. It was therefore no small thing that Mr. Blackwood had decided this year's competition would be judged personally by himself, rather than by the usual rotating committee. Grumbles had been many, but none dared defy him openly. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, thought privately that nothing so small as a flower competition would ever remain truly free of human folly. The judging had been completed, the prizes arranged, and the crowd gathered before the vicarage steps where Mr. Blackwood now stood, puffed with self-importance, ready to announce the winners. Mrs. Symes, cheeks flushed with the exertion of the day, tapped a small brass bell. "For attention! Ladies and gentlemen," she cried, "your attention, please! Mr. Blackwood will now announce the prize winners for this year's flower show." A ripple of polite applause. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat loudly. "My friends," he began, in the ponderous tones of one delivering a sermon rather than awarding prize marrows, "it has been my singular honour to judge your labours this year. The standard, I must say, has been—" whatever lofty phrase was to follow was never heard. For at that very moment a shriek tore through the humid afternoon air. Heads turned, teacups clattered, gasps rose like startled birds from the crowd. Miss Marple set her cup down with the utmost care and rose from her chair. Already a crowd had begun to gather by the rose beds at the far end of the lawn, beyond the bunting and trestle tables. Miss Marple moved swiftly, weaving through the confused, murmuring villagers. At the centre of the throng, half collapsed among the roses, lay the body of Mr. Leonard Blackwood. His arms were flung awkwardly across the blooms. His hat lay crushed beneath him. His broad, ruddy face had already begun to turn an unnatural shade of grey. His mouth sagged open in a silent, frozen cry. Miss Marple knelt, fingers gently touching his wrist. She already knew what she would find, but she checked nonetheless. No pulse, Mr. Blackwood, master of ceremonies, self-proclaimed arbiter of blooms and veg, was dead. A tremor ran through the crowd. "Fetch Dr. Griffith!" someone cried. "No, fetch the police!" another voice shouted. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her face composed. The flower show, it seemed, had produced a winner after all. But the prize was death. Within the hour, Inspector Cray had arrived from Barton Hill, a sturdy, sandy-haired man with a competent manner. The villagers, subdued and murmuring, clustered near the tea-tent as Cray examined the scene. He questioned witnesses briskly. Who had seen Mr. Blackwood last? Who had been near the rose-beds? No one, it seemed, had noticed anything amiss until Molly Drew, going to check her herb arrangement, had stumbled across the body. Molly sat now beside Mrs. Symes, pale and shaken, a cup of sweet tea trembling in her hands. Miss Marple watched everything, saying little. Cray, rising from his brief examination, addressed the assembled villagers. "There's no doubt," he said bluntly, "Mr. Blackwood's neck was broken. This was no accident." A collective gasp. Cray's gaze swept the crowd. "We are treating this as murder." Another sharper murmur spread. Miss Marple adjusted her hat against the breeze. Murder, she thought, in a setting as pretty as a postcard. It was hardly surprising. Wherever human ambitions gathered, even among roses and marrows, trouble often bloomed too. And she, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, intended to see precisely which seeds had been sown in Mayfair in the Dell. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Roses. By the following morning, the shocking death of Mr. Leonard Blackwood had settled over Mayfair in the Dell like an unseasonal frost, chilling every conversation stiffening every polite smile. The flower show, grounds once vibrant and filled with laughter, now stood eerily silent, the bunting drooping damply against the hedgerows. Though the constabulary had cordoned off the rose garden and adjoining areas, the vicarage lawns had become a gathering ground of another sort. In clusters of 2s and 3s, villagers exchanged hurried whispers and furtive glances, each eager to supply or invent the latest speculation. Miss Marple, dressed in a neat navy coat and hat, made her way down the high street, nodding gently to those she passed. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. At the butcher's, Mrs. Simmons leaned across the counter to whisper urgently to old Mr. Fitch, "I tell you, it's just as I said, poison, or some sort of secret quarrel. You mark my words, Blackwood had enemies." Mr. Fitch, carving a ham with careful indifference, grunted noncommittally. Outside the post office, Miss Amelia Hornbeam clutched her handbag tightly, her voice low and earnest as she spoke to Mrs. Hartnell. "Jealousy, that's what it was, over the prize money. You know how much Blackwood flaunted his winnings last year." Mrs. Hartnell tutted disapprovingly, though her eyes gleamed with interest. Over at the Green Man public house, Major Prescott held court by the hearth, a brandy warming between his large hands. "I said it yesterday, and I'll say it again. This wasn't the work of a stranger. No, indeed. Only someone from right here in Mayfair could have got close enough to Blackwood without him suspecting a thing." He tapped his temple meaningfully. "And mark my words, it'll be someone we'd never suspect. Always is." Miss Marple passed unseen among these little eddies of gossip, her mind cataloguing each word, each glance, for human nature, she knew, repeated itself with tedious accuracy. The first reaction to crime was always horror. The second, delightful as children round a Christmas tree, was speculation. The trick, she reflected, was to listen for what was not said. For in Mayfair in the Dell, as in every village she had ever known, secrets grew like bindweed, quietly, tenaciously, and in the most respectable of places. Inspector Cray, meanwhile, had established his temporary headquarters at the village hall. Miss Marple, arriving with a plate of her famous seed cake under one arm, for even an inspector, she reasoned, must eat, found the man himself frowning over a spread of neatly written notes. He accepted the cake with a grunt of thanks and motioned her to a seat. "It's a mess, Miss Marple," he said bluntly. "Too many stories, too many motives, and not a solid clue among them." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly, folding her hands in her lap. "But I dare say a pattern will emerge." Cray shook his head. "Everyone's pointing fingers. Half the village had a quarrel with Blackwood at some point. Major Prescott over the judging rules, Miss Hornbeam over last year's entry fees, Mrs. Simmons over the layout of the vegetable tent." Miss Marple smiled gently. "And yet none of them seems the murdering type." Cray grunted. "All capable of a bit of sharp gossip, perhaps. But murder? Breaking a man's neck?" Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Strength, Inspector, is not merely a matter of brute force. Opportunity, cunning, even a moment of panic, these can be remarkably potent motivators." Cray looked unconvinced. "Perhaps, but without a murder weapon or witness, I'm left chasing shadows." Miss Marple patted his hand comfortingly. Patience, Inspector. Patience." Leaving the hall, Miss Marple decided a quiet stroll past the flower show grounds was in order. She moved slowly, her cane tapping lightly against the path, eyes noting the subtle changes. The trampled grass near the rose tent, the snapped stalks, where someone had pushed roughly through the flower beds. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Symes, was arranging some sad drooping blooms into salvageable poses for the church. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her round face anxious. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands in her apron, "isn't it dreadful? Poor Mr. Blackwood." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently. Mrs. Symes leaned closer. "And to think, it happened right here in broad daylight, with all of us about. Why, anyone could have slipped away from the prize tent for a moment." "Quite," said Miss Marple, "and I was only just speaking with Molly Drew, poor child. She says she saw someone near the rose beds before the announcement." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Someone? Whom? Mrs. Symes hesitated, lowering her voice to a whisper. She wouldn't say exactly, only that she caught a glimpse of a figure, someone moving quickly among the roses. She thought it might have been Major Prescott, but, well, you know how confusing things can be when one is excited. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Confusion, yes, but also instinct, and Molly Drew, shy though she was, had little reason to invent such a thing. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Molly Drew at the modest cottage she shared with her widowed mother. Molly answered the door herself, looking pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, "please come in." Inside, the little sitting-room was spotlessly clean, but rather bare. Mrs. Drew hovered anxiously, offering tea, but Miss Marple declined gently. "I only came to have a little chat," she said, settling herself comfortably in a chair. "About what you saw yesterday." Molly twisted her hands in her lap. I don't know what I saw, Miss Marple. It all happened so fast." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "but often our first impressions are the truest." Molly hesitated, then nodded. "I was arranging my herbs, you see. I looked up, just for a moment, and I saw someone moving through the rose bushes. A man, I think, tall, broad. Major Prescott, perhaps?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Molly shook her head quickly. "No, at least I don't think so. This man, he was moving differently, quicker, almost furtively." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "And did you notice anything else?" Molly bit her lip. "Was wearing something dark, a coat maybe, and gloves. I thought it odd with the weather so warm." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very helpful." Outside she paused on the path, looking back towards the vicarage garden. Gloves on a warm day. A heavy coat in bright sunshine. Someone, it seemed, had come to the flower show not to celebrate, but prepared for something far more sinister. And now, Miss Marple thought, the true game would begin. Chapter 3. Early Suspicions. The days following Mr. Blackwood's death brought a peculiar kind of tension to Mayfair in the Dell, a brittle cheerfulness that cracked under the slightest pressure. People spoke in lowered voices, smiled too brightly, and crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. And yet beneath the surface, suspicion spread like wildfire across the neatly trimmed lawns and rose trellises. Inspector Cray, determined to make headway, had begun formal interviews at the village hall. Each day saw a new procession of respectable villagers trooping grimly into the panelled room, returning pale and tight-lipped. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a fascinating spectacle, the guilty and innocent alike behaving awkwardly simply from the mere proximity to scandal. Seated in her usual place beneath the window of her neat sitting room, Miss Marple knitted steadily, her mind clicking over the puzzle at hand as swiftly as her needles. What Molly Drew had seen, someone tall, broad, wearing gloves and a heavy coat, did not seem to fit any immediate suspect neatly. Major Prescott was tall, yes, but hardly furtive. And the others? Too short, too slight, too unassuming. Unless, of course, the disguise was deliberate. The thought stirred something deep in Miss Marple's mind. A faint memory, a whisper of another village scandal long ago, where appearances had deceived everyone until it was nearly too late. She tucked it away for later consideration. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray's inquiries produced what, on the surface, seemed like promising leads. It emerged that Mr. Blackwood had not been as universally beloved as the village eulogies suggested. He had, in fact, made himself rather a number of enemies in recent months. There was Major Prescott, whose prized cabbages had been disqualified from last year's show on a technicality, instigated by Blackwood himself. The Major, never one to forgive lightly, had nursed his resentment with rum and loud proclamations at the Green Man. There was Miss Amelia Hornbeam, whose meticulously arranged dahlias had been passed over year after year, with casual cruelty by Blackwood's judgmental eye. And then there was young Molly Drew herself. It had been whispered, though no one could say precisely where it began, that Blackwood had shown an unwelcome interest in the shy girl, offering her patronage for her herb garden in a way that made Mrs. Symes purse her lips and mutter darkly. When Inspector Cray assembled these facts and presented them to Miss Marple later that week, he did so with the air of a man expecting easy vindication. "There you have it," he said, tapping his notebook with satisfaction. "3 solid suspects, all with cause to dislike the man." Miss Marple smiled gently. "And yet, Inspector, dislike is not always enough to lead to murder." Cray frowned. He was a pompous old windbag who held half the village's ambitions in his fat hands. Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so. But you must remember, my dear Inspector, in a place like Mayfair, a sharp word or a slighted prize is grievous, but rarely fatal." She set her knitting aside and leaned forward slightly. "Consider instead who had something truly to gain, or something vital to lose." Cray looked unconvinced. "Gain? It's not as if Blackwood was sitting on a fortune." Miss Marple smiled enigmatically. "Not all fortunes are counted in pounds and pence." That afternoon, while the village continued its quiet speculation, Miss Marple went visiting. Her first stop was the Green Man, where she found Major Prescott nursing a pint and scowling into the fireplace. "Mind if I join you, Major?" she asked sweetly. He grunted an assent. They spoke first of the weather, of spring planting, of the lamentable state of the vicar's roof, all safe topics. Only when the Major had relaxed somewhat did Miss Marple steer the conversation toward the flower show. "Such a pity about Mr. Blackwood," she said, stirring her tea. The Major snorted. "Can't say I mourn him, Jane. Man was a meddling old fool. Wouldn't know a decent marrow if it danced a jig across his prize table." Miss Marple chuckled politely. "But, Murder Major, surely that seems excessive." He grunted again. "Excessive? Yes, but people snap. You put a man's pride up for public judging every year. Someone's bound to boil over sooner or later." He drained his pint. "Mark me, Miss Marple. It wasn't the grand folk you need to watch. It's the ones you'd never suspect." She smiled, nodding thoughtfully. The ones you'd never suspect. Her second visit of the day was to Molly Drew's cottage. She found Molly alone, sitting on the narrow back step with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes red-rimmed. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, sitting beside her, "how are you bearing up?" Molly shrugged. "I keep thinking, maybe if I'd shouted or run to fetch someone, maybe Mr. Blackwood wouldn't be—" Her voice broke. Miss Marple patted her hand. "There, there. Nothing you could have done would have changed matters." Molly swallowed hard. "I didn't like him," she said in a rush. "I was afraid of him. He made remarks, touched my arm when no one was looking. I told my mother, but she said not to make a fuss. 'Mr. Blackwood's important,' she said." Tears welled in her eyes. "But now he's dead and everyone's looking at me as if I—" Miss Marple squeezed her hand. "You are not to worry, my dear. Truth, like cream, has a way of rising." She stayed with Molly a little longer, speaking of safe things, herbs, gardens, the coming of summer, until the girl's colour returned. As she left, Miss Marple's mind was troubled. The darkness behind Blackwood's facade was deeper than she had first supposed, and the village, she knew, would be slow to believe ill of a man who had chaired their committees and judged their roses. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her needles flashing in the lamplight. She thought of Molly's fear, of Major Prescott's bitterness, of Amelia Hornbeam's simmering resentment, and of the man Molly had glimpsed among the roses, tall, broad, gloved, not one of the obvious suspects, perhaps, but someone with reason to disguise themselves, someone with a pressing motive, not merely to hate Leonard Blackwood, but to silence him forever. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small, satisfied smile. The garden of Mayfair in the Dell was full of secrets, and she, as always, was ready to prune them back until the truth stood bare. Chapter 4. A Clue Among the Petals. The following morning dawned damp and misty, the hedgerows of Mayfair in the Dell glistening with dew. To an ordinary passer-by, the village seemed to be returning to normal. Milk delivered, newspapers tucked into letterboxes, the slow, steady rhythm of English country life ticking on. But to those who knew how to listen, to the tilt of a shopkeeper's eyebrow, to the sudden hush when a familiar figure passed, the tension was palpable. Miss Marple, having finished her modest breakfast, decided that a stroll through the vicarage gardens was in order. Officially, the grounds remained closed under Inspector Cray's orders, but a quiet word to the vicar's wife, and the understanding that she would tread lightly, allowed her access. The grass was still pressed flat where the crowd had gathered. The rose beds, once so pristine, were now ragged and bruised, the blooms battered by hasty footsteps and careless trampling. Miss Marple moved slowly among the wreckage, her sharp eyes scanning every petal, every blade of grass. The scene, she thought, was like a jigsaw puzzle whose pieces had been tossed in the air. One only needed patience and a keen sense of what belonged to begin fitting it back together. Near the second row of rose bushes, something caught her attention. She stooped carefully, her fingers brushing aside a fallen cluster of petals. There, half buried in the damp earth, was a button, not an ordinary button either. It was heavy, brass, with a faint insignia worked into its surface, a crest of some kind. Miss Marple turned it over in her gloved hand. Interesting. A quick survey of the nearby bushes revealed no obvious signs of torn fabric, no snagged threads, but she tucked the button carefully into her reticule nonetheless. A man wearing gloves and a heavy coat on a warm day, a button torn away in a struggle, or hurried flight. Miss Marple straightened, her mind whirring. Who, she wondered, wore a coat with such buttons? Military uniforms, perhaps? Or ceremonial dress? Or, she paused, considering, something theatrical? Thought seemed fanciful. But she had learned long ago that the absurd and the criminal often made remarkably cosy bedfellows. Later that day, she made a point of passing the Green Man public house. The inn sign, a faded green figure with a merry face, creaked gently in the breeze. Inside, the usual lunchtime clientele gathered. Farmers in heavy boots, labourers nursing pints, a few old gaffers playing dominoes in the corner. Major Prescott occupied his customary place by the fire. Miss Marple entered, nodding politely, and approached the bar where Mr. Ellison, the landlord, was polishing glasses. "Good day, Mr. Ellison," she said pleasantly. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a glass of lemonade." "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, bustling to comply. While he worked, she glanced around casually. Her eye caught a small notice pinned near. The bar, Mayfair Amateur Dramatic Society. Summer production, The Scarlet Pimpernel. Costume fittings every Thursday at the Village Hall. Miss Marple smiled to herself. A theatrical production. Costumes.coats, brass buttons. It fitted, or could be made to fit, with the strange figure Molly Drew had glimpsed at the flower show. Man dressed not in his ordinary clothes, but in the remnants of a costume, something that would explain the heavy coat, the gloves, even the furtive movement through the roses. And if so, who among the villagers was involved with the Amateur Dramatic Society? Miss Marple sipped her lemonade thoughtfully. Quite a number. As she recalled, Major Prescott had a fondness for playing comic colonels. Miss Hornbeam was a regular stage manager. Even Mr. Ellison had been known to lend his booming voice to minor roles. But perhaps more significantly, Leonard Blackwood himself had been patron of the society. And according to Mrs. Symes's vague gossip, not a universally popular one. Miss Marple's mind moved quickly now, stitching the fragments together. Someone, she thought, had planned well, concealed themselves cleverly, and nearly succeeded in disappearing among the flowers. Returning home, she found a surprise awaiting her. Inspector Cray, pacing impatiently outside her gate. "Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat, "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course, Inspector," she said serenely. "Would you care for tea?" He declined, clearly restless. "I've been thinking about what you said," he admitted, "about gain rather than mere dislike." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And?" Cray hesitated, checked Blackwood's personal papers, bank accounts, deeds, that sort of thing. Turns out he was trustee for a fund set up for the flower show grounds years ago. A tidy sum, quietly growing all these years. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. And it's missing, Cray said grimly. Transferred out 2 months ago. No record of where it went. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against her reticule. A motive far more compelling than bruised. Pride, she murmured. Cray's brow furrowed. But no proof. Miss Marple smiled gently. Proof, Inspector, often rests in the small things. A careless word, a forgotten button. Cray's gaze sharpened. Button. Without a word, Miss Marple drew the brass button from her bag and placed it in his palm. He whistled softly. "Where did you find this?" "Near the rose beds," she said simply. "Where Mr. Blackwood was found." Cray turned the button over, examining it closely. Military, perhaps. Miss Marple shook her head. More likely a theatrical costume. From the Amateur Dramatic Society. Cray's expression changed. A disguise. Precisely, Miss Marple said. The perfect way to slip among a crowd without notice, to approach an unsuspecting man, perhaps even lure him into a quiet spot without raising alarm. Cray straightened, energized. "I'll have a word with the society at once. See who had access to the costumes." Miss Marple smiled, pleased. "And when you find your man, Inspector," she said softly, "I think you will find the missing money close behind." Outside, the church clock struck 3, its clear tones carrying across the green fields. Time, Miss Marple thought, was running out for the murderer, and she, as always, would be there when the final chime sounded. Chapter 5. Suspects in Costume. Inspector Cray lost no time in following Miss Marple's suggestion. By early the next morning, a notice was pinned up at the village hall summoning members of the Mayfair Amateur Dramatic Society to a brief inquiry regarding important village matters. The wording, neutral and non-threatening, had been Miss Marple's idea. Far better, she had said gently, to catch flies with honey than vinegar. By 10 o'clock, the society's principal members had gathered in the hall, a rather dusty, high-ceilinged room with creaky wooden chairs and faded banners from long-past fates drooping from the rafters. Miss Marple sat quietly in a corner, ostensibly knitting, but listening with every ounce of her formidable attention. Inspector Cray stood at the front, clipboard in hand. "We appreciate your cooperation," he began briskly. "It's come to our attention that certain costume items, specifically military coats, may have been taken or borrowed recently." A ripple of glances passed among the small group. The Major was there, stiff and indignant in a well-pressed tweed. Miss Hornbeam clutched her handbag as though expecting it to be searched. Mr. Ellison, the landlord of the Green Man, shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, and there, standing slightly apart from the others, was George Ferrars, a tall, broad-shouldered man recently returned to the village after several years working in London. Miss Marple noted Ferrars particularly. His dark hair, his heavy build, both matched Molly Drew's vague description. He was newly returned, something of an outsider now, yet with old village ties. "Did anyone borrow a costume item without informing the committee?" Cray asked, glancing around the room. Silence. He pressed further. "Were any items reported missing after your last fitting session?" Miss Hornbeam cleared her throat nervously. "There was a coat," she said. "A heavy red military coat, part of the Scarlet Pimpernel wardrobe. Brass buttons. We thought it had simply been mislaid." Cray nodded slowly. And when did you last see it?" "Thursday before the flower show," she said. "It was hanging on the back rail." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Thursday. Just 3 days before the flower show. Plenty of time to appropriate a disguise, she thought, and no one would have noticed in the festival preparations. Cray turned his attention to George Ferrars. "You, Mr. Ferrars? You recently rejoined the society, did you not?" Ferrars smiled thinly. "Yes. I thought it would be a pleasant way to reacquaint myself with village life." His voice was calm enough, but Miss Marple noticed a slight stiffness in his stance, a defensive squaring of the shoulders that spoke louder than words. "Did you attend the last costume fitting?" Cray pressed. Ferrars hesitated just a fraction too long. "I dropped in briefly, but I didn't stay. Anyone see you leave?" Cray asked sharply. Ferrars shrugged. "I believe Mrs. Simmons was there." Cray made a note, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in Ferrars's eyes. He was lying, or at least hiding something. And lies, she thought, always pointed toward the heart of a crime. After the meeting dispersed, Inspector Cray and Miss Marple conferred quietly outside. "Ferrars fits the description," Cray said grimly. "Tall, broad, gloves to cover the hands, coat to hide the build." "And motive?" Miss Marple asked gently. Cray shook his head. "None that we know of yet, but I'll wager Blackwood was trustee of more than just the flower show fund. I've sent to London for Ferrars' financial records." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Follow the money, Inspector. It so often leads directly to the heart of the matter." She paused, glancing back toward the departing villagers. "Yet I am not convinced Ferrars acted alone." Cray raised an eyebrow. "You think there's a second party involved?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "There is often a guiding hand," she said softly, "a subtler mind behind a bold action." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Simmons under the pretext of returning a borrowed cake tin. Mrs. Simmons, bustling and chatty, welcomed her in eagerly. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she said, bustling about with the tea things. "But between you and me, I'm not surprised." "Not surprised," Miss Marple echoed gently. Mrs. Simmons leaned closer. "George Ferrars? He's not the sort of man you'd trust, you know. Ran into some trouble in London. Money missing from a club he managed. Nothing proven, of course, but—" She tapped her nose knowingly. Miss Marple absorbed this with mild interest. "And you saw him at the costume fitting?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Simmons said. "Came in late. Stayed a while, poking about the racks." She hesitated. "And he wasn't alone?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "No." Mrs. Simmons glanced over her shoulder, then lowered her voice. "He was talking to Miss Hornbeam." Miss Marple sat very still. Miss Amelia Hornbeam, the mild, fluttering spinster who had been overlooked year after year at the flower show. "Talking how, Mrs. Simmons?" Mrs. Simmons shrugged, whispering, looking at papers. She didn't look happy. Miss Marple set down her teacup with care. "Interesting. Very interesting." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched on her lap. The pieces were aligning themselves: George Ferrars, the strong arm, Miss Hornbeam, the local, mined with a long simmering resentment and a desperate need to protect her modest reputation. And the missing flower show fund, quietly absorbed, carefully hidden, until Blackwood discovered it and threatened to expose everything. Murder, Miss Marple thought, often grew not from hatred alone, but from fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of ruin, fear of the truth coming out. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl about her shoulders. Tomorrow, she decided, it would be time to set the final trap. Time to lay the bait and see who, in dear little Mayfair in the Dell, would step into it. Chapter 6. Miss Marple Lays a Trap. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sort of fine English day that seemed to wash clean the worries of the world. In Mayfair in the Dell, however, the fine weather did little to lift the growing unease that gripped the village. Miss Marple, calm and composed, sat at her breakfast table, her mind already busy with the plan she intended to set in motion. It would require delicacy, subtlety, and above all, a deep understanding of human frailty. Fortunately, she had spent a lifetime cultivating all three. After a quiet morning spent writing letters and tending her garden, she set out for the vicarage under the pretext of discussing the upcoming harvest, festival arrangements with Mrs. Symes. The vicar's wife, flustered but grateful for any normalcy, welcomed her warmly. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's good to talk of ordinary things again," she said, leading the way into the sitting-room. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed serenely, taking a seat and folding her hands neatly in her lap. They spoke for some time of bunting, of the choir's woeful shortage of tenors, and the difficulty of coaxing the younger generation into organising the produce stalls. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, Miss Marple steered the conversation toward the flower show. "And such a pity," she said lightly, "about poor Mr. Blackwood. I gather he was about to make a rather important announcement before his unfortunate demise." Mrs. Symes looked startled. "An announcement?" Miss Marple nodded benignly. "Oh, yes. Something to do with the flower show finances, I believe. Something about changes that would affect many people." Mrs. Symes's cheeks paled, slightly. "Goodness, I hadn't heard." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Well, you know how these things are. Still, I dare say those involved know exactly what he intended to reveal." She rose, accepting Mrs. Symes's protests that she stay for another cup of tea, with a gracious smile and a few murmured excuses about errands. The seed, she thought, had been planted. Now it was only a matter of watching to see who felt compelled to uproot it. That afternoon, she went walking along the lane behind the vicarage, a route that passed both the Greenman public house and the modest cottages where many of the villagers lived. She made no secret of her movements, nodding pleasantly to those she encountered, stopping now and again to exchange a few harmless words about the weather or the state of the dahlias. And as she moved among them, she saw what she had expected. George Ferrars, standing stiffly by. The post office glanced sharply at her approach, then turned away abruptly. Miss Amelia Hornbeam, bustling out of the grocer's with her basket, nearly dropped it when she caught sight of Miss Marple and scurried off with uncharacteristic haste. Trap, it seemed, was beginning to close. At tea-time, Miss Marple invited Inspector Cray to her cottage. He arrived, hat in hand, looking weary but determined. "You have something, Miss Marple?" he asked as she poured him a cup of strong Assam. "I believe so," she said quietly. "You must arrange to have all the principal villagers gathered at the village hall tomorrow evening. Say it is for a public announcement about the flower show funds, something to set matters straight." Cray's eyebrows rose, and then, Miss Marple said serenely, "We shall watch and listen." She leaned forward slightly. The guilty inspector rarely fear facts, but they fear exposure. The next evening, under the fading gold light of an autumn sun, the villagers gathered at the hall. The atmosphere was thick with tension, though no one could quite have said why. The Major sat near the front, arms folded across his chest. Mrs. Simmons whispered furiously to Mrs. Hartnell. Molly Drew, pale but composed, sat beside her mother. And at the very back, almost hidden by the doorway, stood George Ferrars and Miss Hornbeam, both looking far more anxious than the occasion warranted. Inspector Cray stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said briskly, "thank you for attending. We have made certain discoveries regarding the flower show funds and Mr. Blackwood's role." A stir ran through the room. We believe Mr. Blackwood had uncovered evidence of financial misconduct, Cray continued, and intended to expose it at the flower show. Gasps. Cray let the silence deepen. "And we believe," he said slowly, "that someone here knew it and acted to prevent him." The hall seemed to contract, every breath drawn tight. Miss Marple rose quietly, her slight figure commanding more attention than any shouted command could have. "May I add," she said sweetly, "that Mr. Blackwood left behind written records which, when examined carefully, point quite clearly to those responsible." This, of course, was not strictly true, but it was a truth close enough to pierce guilty hearts. Miss Hornbeam gave a strangled gasp. George Ferrars stiffened, his face a mask of rage and panic. In that instant, the room seemed to tilt toward revelation. Miss Marple watched with serene certainty as George Ferrars stepped forward, then faltered as Miss Hornbeam seized his arm. "You promised," she cried, her voice rising. "You said it would be simple. You said no one would ever know." Ferrars shook her off. "You little fool," he snarled. "It was your idea to steal the money. Your idea to use me to—" He stopped abruptly, realizing too late that he had sealed his own doom. Inspector Cray moved swiftly, signalling to his men. There was no resistance, only a terrible sagging collapse as Ferrars realized the game was up. Miss Hornbeam sobbed quietly into her lace handkerchief. Miss Marple, serene once more, resumed her seat. It was, she reflected, a sad but inevitable ending. Greed, ambition, fear of disgrace, such things had laid a far stronger trap than any she could have devised. She had merely pointed the way. Later, as the villagers dispersed in shocked clusters, Miss Marple and Inspector Cray shared a quiet word by the door. "You were right," Cray said simply. "About all of it." Miss Marple smiled. "One sees so much," she said gently, "when one is thought too old or too harmless to notice." She patted his arm kindly. "And now, Inspector, I suggest you have a good strong cup of tea. Nothing restores the spirits after murder quite like it." Outside, the church bells began to chime the hour, their clear voices rising into the night. The village of Mayfair in the Dell would heal in time, but it would never again be quite so innocent. Chapter 7. A final twist at dusk. Though George Ferrars and Miss Hornbeam were in custody, and Inspector Cray had declared the case neatly closed, Miss Marple, sitting by her fire that evening, found herself unable to settle entirely. She had seen too many village dramas unfold to mistake the obvious ending for the true one. Ferraz's outburst in the village hall had been genuine enough, as had Miss Hornbeam's desperate confession. Their motives, the fear of exposure, the humiliation of discovery, were credible. Their opportunity, the missing costume, the confusion of the flower show, was established. And yet Miss Marple frowned slightly, her knitting forgotten in Shin Utters, her lap. There was something that still whispered at the back of her mind. A detail, a question left unanswered, like a missing petal on a perfect rose. She rose slowly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, and made her way into the cooling twilight. The village was quiet now, the air heavy with the rich scent of earth and late-blooming roses. Lamps glowed faintly behind curtained windows, and somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage gardens, her steps unhurried. It was not the place she needed to see, it was the atmosphere. The sense of something overlooked. She stood for a long time by the battered rose beds where Leonard Blackwood had fallen. The grass was still scuffed, the blooms drooping. But now that the hubbub had died away, she noticed something that had escaped her before. Position of the body. Everyone had assumed that Blackwood had been killed in the rose beds themselves, that he had been lured there, struck down, and left where he fell. But now, standing alone in the dim evening light, Miss Marple saw it differently. The scuffs in the grass trailed not toward the roses, but away from them, as if Blackwood had been attacked somewhere else, and dragged here, hurriedly, clumsily, to stage the scene. She turned sharply, scanning the surrounding area. A small, forgotten garden shed stood some 20 yards away, half hidden by overgrown laurel bushes. Miss Marple moved toward it. The door hung ajar, its hinges squeaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the faint smell of damp wood and rusted tools lingered, and there, faint but unmistakable in the packed earth floor, was a darker stain. Miss Marple knelt carefully. Blood, dried now, almost invisible against the dirt, but blood nonetheless. Leonard Blackwood had not died in the rose beds. He had died here. She rose slowly, her heart quickening, and if he had been killed here, then someone had gone to great lengths to mislead the investigation. Someone cleverer, more calculating than George Ferraz. Someone who had seen the opportunity presented by Ferraz's clumsy theft of the costume and seized it. The next morning, Miss Marple requested another meeting with Inspector Cray. They sat together in the small office he had commandeered at the village hall. She told him quietly what she had found. Cray's face darkened as she spoke. "So you think," he said slowly, "that Ferraz and Hornbeam stole the money, but someone else killed Blackwood?" Miss Marple nodded. Ferraz had no subtlety. He could be violent, yes, but opportunistic. Miss Hornbeam is clever, but not ruthless. She folded her hands calmly. The dragging of the body, the staging of the scene, that smacks of planning, of manipulation. Cray ran a hand through his hair. "Good Lord," he muttered, "we've been looking at this all wrong." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not wrong, Inspector, merely incomplete." Cray rose abruptly. And you have a theory?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Of course, that afternoon another meeting was called at the village hall, though this time only a select few were invited. Major Prescott, Mrs. Simmons, Molly Drew, and her mother. And notably, Mr. Ellison, the landlord of the Green Man. Miss Marple sat near the front, a small, unassuming figure. Inspector Cray addressed the group briskly. "There are new developments," he said. "It appears Mr. Blackwood was not killed where he was found." Gasps and mutters rippled through the gathering. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And it seems," she said sweetly, "that the murderer took advantage of the chaos at the flower show to conceal his true crime." Her eyes rested gently on Mr. Ellison. The landlord flushed. "I don't know what you mean," he said hastily. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "You knew about the missing flower show fund," she said. "You had access to the accounts. Blackwood confronted you, privately, discreetly, because he had no wish to cause public scandal." She paused, knitting the room's silence into a taut thread. "But you had no intention of letting him reveal your part in the theft." Mr. Ellison shook his head violently. "That's nonsense, is it?" Miss Marple said softly. "You lured him to the garden shed, struck him down, and when Faraz's foolish disguise provided a convenient scapegoat, you seized the chance to stage the scene." Her gaze sharpened. "You moved the body, dropped the button you had picked up, made sure the blame would fall elsewhere." Mr. Ellison lurched to his feet. "You can't prove it." Cray stepped forward. "We don't need to," he said grimly. "You just did. There was no need for handcuffs." Mr. Ellison sagged where he stood, all the fight gone out of him. The room exhaled in a collective murmur. Miss Marple sat back, serene once more. It was over, truly over, later that evening, as twilight once again folded itself gently over Mayfair in the dell. Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden. The village would heal. It always did. The harvest festival would come, and the flower show would be rebuilt. Gossip would soften into anecdote. Scandal would fade into local legend. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea, knew better than to believe that evil only visited from the outside. It grew, sometimes, in the most familiar soil. It took root in ambition, in fear, in desperation, and it bloomed when the season was right, with all the deadly beauty of a perfect rose. She smiled faintly to herself. Human nature, after all, was the truest garden she had ever tended, and she knew every weed it could produce. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Reflection. The scandal of the Mayfair Flower Show faded as all scandals eventually do, absorbed into the gentle rhythms of village life. In the weeks that followed, the church bells resumed their cheerful tolling, the shops reopened with bright new displays, and the children raced once again across the green, without worried mothers calling them back with every gust of wind. Yet for all its surface normality, Mayfair in the dell had changed. A thin layer of wariness hung in the air like the mist that crept in from the river on autumn mornings. Trust, once so easily given, was now measured with care. Friendships were weighed and reassessed. Polite nods concealed lingering doubts. Miss Marple, however, seemed untouched by the village's shaken confidence. She moved through her days with the same gentle grace as always, smiling kindly, exchanging recipes, commenting on the weather. But those who knew her best, those few who had seen her cool, steady hand untangle the terrible knot of murder, looked at her now with a kind of awe. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the sun slipping lower across the village rooftops, when Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray in the vicarage garden, sipping a modest glass of sherry, and reviewing the case one final time. "I must admit," Cray said, stretching his legs before him, "you had it right from the beginning, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly, folding her hands. "One learns to trust the little signs, Inspector. People so often betray themselves, not by grand gestures, but by tiny, thoughtless habits." Cray nodded thoughtfully. "It was the dragging of the body that convinced you, wasn't it?" Miss Marple sipped her sherry. "That and the button." She set her glass down delicately. "A man who plans murder carefully does not lose parts of his disguise, but a man who acts rashly, or who adapts to an unexpected opportunity, makes mistakes." She looked toward the church spire, glowing golden against the sky. George Ferrars and Miss Hornbeam were guilty, yes, but of greed and panic, not cold-blooded calculation. Cray rubbed his chin. "And Ellison? Fear," said Miss Marple softly. "Fear that Blackwood would expose his theft. Fear that his comfortable position would collapse." She smiled without mirth. "And so he killed to preserve his respectability, only to lose it entirely." Cray shook his head. "You know, I used to think murderers were extraordinary people, monsters. But you've shown me they're just ordinary folk, given the wrong pressure at the wrong time." Miss Marple chuckled. "My dear Inspector, you have learned a great truth. Evil is rarely dramatic in real life. It grows quietly, in resentment and selfishness, until it finds expression in one terrible act." She rose slowly, brushing a stray petal from her skirt, "and when it does, it leaves traces. Always." Cray rose too, offering his arm gallantly. "And thank heavens you're here to spot them." Miss Marple laughed, a soft, delighted sound. "Not at all, Inspector. I am merely observant." They strolled together across the vicarage lawn, two solitary figures framed by the lengthening shadows of evening. In the following days, the village turned itself toward the harvest festival, with particular vigour. Perhaps it was an unconscious effort to restore what had been broken. Perhaps it was simply that life, no matter how bruised, insists on continuing. The Women's Institute threw themselves into jam-making and pie-baking. The choir rehearsed hymns with newfound earnestness. Even the reluctant young men, so difficult to coax into volunteering before, now offered to help with setting up the stalls and decorations. It was, Miss Marple thought, a very human response. When darkness passed through, one rebuilt, quietly, stubbornly, with flour-dusted aprons and the murmur of old hymns. On the morning of the harvest festival, Miss Marple received a visitor, young Molly Drew, dressed in her best Sunday coat, her eyes brighter and more confident than Miss Marple had ever seen them. "Miss Marple," she said shyly, holding out a small bundle. I thought you might like these." Inside the bundle was a posy of late summer herbs, rosemary, thyme, and a scattering of tiny marigolds. Miss Marple accepted it with genuine pleasure. "Thank you, my dear, they are beautiful." Molly flushed with pride. "Mother says Mother says we owe you everything." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Not at all, Molly. You owe yourselves everything. You were brave and honest. That is the truest strength of all." Molly hesitated, then blurted out, "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, my dear, normality is a very resilient thing. It bends and stretches, but it always comes back. Slightly changed, perhaps, but still recognizably itself." She set the little posy in a jar on the window-sill, where it caught the morning light. "And you, Molly Drew, are part of that normality. Stronger now. Wiser." Molly beamed, and with a final shy curtsy, she disappeared down the garden path, her step lighter than it had been in weeks. Miss Marple watched her go with quiet satisfaction. That evening, as the last golden light slanted across the village green, Miss Marple took her usual walk before supper. The harvest festival was in full swing, the stalls heaped high with apples and pumpkins, the tables laden with pies and cider, the air alive with laughter and the rich smell of autumn. Children darted among the booths, their cheeks red with excitement. Couples strolled arm in arm, the church bells pealed joyously, carrying across the fields. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the green, watching. There would be new scandals in Mayfair in the dell, new quarrels and new reconciliations. Human nature was an inexhaustible garden of small dramas and large follies. But for now, all was well. She turned toward home, her steps sure and steady. The mystery of the flower show had been solved. Justice, in its quiet English way, had been served, and life, as it always did, went on. Miss Marple, smiling faintly, disappeared into the gathering dusk, content in the knowledge that whatever secrets the future might hold, she would be ready, as always. Chapter 9. The Quiet Reckonings. Though the excitement of the harvest festival had warmed the village with a much-needed sense of renewal, the lingering ripples of the flower show scandal continued to gently disturb the surface of life in Mayfair in the dell. Miss Marple, now regarded with a mixture of admiration and gentle apprehension by many of the villagers, resumed her usual quiet routines, yet she remained as observant as ever. It was in the little, almost imperceptible changes that she saw the deeper aftermath of the crime. The vicar, for instance, delivered his sermons with a new gravity, often pausing as if weighing his words more carefully. His sermons on forgiveness had a sharper edge now, as if he understood that forgiveness required first a full acknowledgment of wrongdoing. Mrs. Symes, the vicar's wife, busied herself with the harvest festival accounts, triple-checking every figure and insisting on more transparency, a word that had rarely been spoken in the village before. At the Green Man, Mr. Ellison's absence was keenly felt, though the pubs still opened promptly each evening under the temporary stewardship of a neighbouring landlord. The heart of it, the easy bonhomie, the local gossip traded over pints, seemed thinner, more cautious. Trust once broken, Miss Marple mused, took a long time to repair. And then there were the quieter reckonings, the ones not spoken of in public. Miss Amelia Hornbeam, though cleared of the charge of murder, could not so easily shrug off the stain of her involvement. She rarely ventured beyond her small cottage now, and when she did, her former fluttering confidence had given way to furtive glances and hurried steps. Miss Marple, encountered her one afternoon outside the village post office. Miss Hornbeam started, at the sight of her, clutching her handbag to her chest. "Good afternoon, Miss Hornbeam," Miss Marple said gently, as if greeting her as she always had. Miss Hornbeam flushed deeply. I hope, Miss Marple," she stammered, "that you don't think. That is, Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. "Dear, guilt is a heavy burden. But shame, when it arises from remorse, can be turned into something better. You have the opportunity to live honestly now. I trust you will seize it." Tears welled suddenly in Miss Hornbeam's eyes. She nodded mutely and hurried away, but with a slightly straighter back than before. Miss Marple watched her go with quiet satisfaction. Redemption, she thought, was not so much a matter of grand gestures, but of thousands of small daily choices. And even in a place like Mayfair in the Dell, where everyone knew everyone else's business, such choices mattered. Inspector Cray, too, had settled back into his duties with a renewed sense of realism. He called upon Miss Marple a week after the festival, bearing a small bouquet of late roses and a rather bashful expression. "Just wanted to say thank you," he said, setting the flowers on her table. "Officially, of course, the constabulary solved the case, but we both know who really did." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "You flatter me, Inspector. I merely observed what was already there." Cray chuckled, "and made sense of it when none of the rest of us could." He sobered, his gaze thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how evil grows quietly." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "It does, and so, Inspector, does goodness. Quietly, patiently, unnoticed often, but it grows all the same." Cray smiled a little wistfully. "I hope you're right." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I am." There were a few final threads to tie. Young Molly Drew, heartened by the village's support, and perhaps bolstered by her narrow brush with tragedy, had accepted a new position as assistant gardener at one of the nearby estates. Miss Marple visited her on her last afternoon in the village, finding her packing a battered valise with neat efficiency. "You'll do very well, my dear," Miss Marple said, adjusting the sprig of rosemary tucked behind Molly's ear. "Gardens need tender, patient hands, and so does life." Molly hugged her fiercely. "I'll come back and visit," she promised. "And I'll write." Miss Marple smiled. "I shall look forward to hearing all about your new adventures." As she watched the girl walk briskly down the lane, valise swinging at her side, Miss Marple felt a rare swell of pride. One life saved, one future reclaimed. It was, she thought, more than many mysteries allowed. On a quiet evening not long after, Miss Marple sat once more in her favourite chair by the fire, a new piece of knitting in her lap. Outside, the village settled into its autumnal rhythm, chimneys puffing lazy smoke into the cool air, children practising Christmas carols under the stern eye of Miss Felton the schoolmistress, the shops preparing their modest holiday displays. Mayfair in the Dell would never again be quite so innocent, but it would endure. In time, the stories would soften. Leonard Blackwood would become a figure of whispered cautionary tales. Mr. Ellison's betrayal would fade into local legend, and the flower show, that most cherished of village traditions, would resume, with stricter accounting measures and perhaps a less despotic chairman. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she set down her knitting. and picked up her book. In a world prone to upheaval and sorrow, the small continuities of village life, the baking of cakes, the planting of gardens, the exchanging of gossip, were as vital as breath, and she, Jane Marple, intended to go on watching them, tending them and protecting them where she could. For human nature was endlessly fascinating, endlessly fallible, and endlessly worth understanding. Chapter 10. The Last Rose of Summer. The days shortened swiftly in Mayfair in the Dell. September's gold deepened into October's russet, and the first crisp nights sent the scent of wood smoke curling through the village lanes. The flower show, scandal, already softened in the telling, became a half-whispered memory, wrapped in layers of rumour and cautionary embellishment. The vicar's sermons carried a renewed solemnity. The Women's Institute hosted charity teas for the sake of village harmony, and the younger generation spoke more readily of cricket matches and harvest dances than of the dark events of August. But if the surface of life gleamed brighter, Miss Marple, seated contentedly in her front parlour, knew that beneath it all something had subtly shifted. Trust, once broken, healed slowly. Wounds to a community left faint scars, and perhaps that was no bad thing, she thought, setting her teacup gently back on its saucer. There was strength sometimes in remembering. On a mild afternoon toward the end of October, the new chairman of the Flower Show Committee, Major Prescott, chosen after much debate and with solemn promises of fair play, paid a call on Miss Marple. He arrived in full regalia, his medals gleaming, bearing a large bouquet of late-blooming roses. "Miss Marple," he said, blushing fiercely as he thrust the bouquet into her hands, "the committee insisted I come and thank you properly. Without your sharp eyes and sound judgment, well," he coughed awkwardly, "we should all be the poorer." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "How very kind, Major, though I only did what anyone might have done." "Rubbish, ma'am," the Major said, thumping his stick on the floor. "Sharp as a tack, that's what you are. Would have had Scotland Yard scratching their heads till Christmas." Miss Marple laughed softly. The Major stayed for tea, launching into a long and rambling account of the improvements he intended to introduce for the next flower show. Stricter accounting, fairer judging, even a youth category to encourage the younger set. Miss Marple listened with polite interest, gently steering him away from his more outlandish ideas involving marching bands and fireworks. It was, she thought later, as she waved him off down the lane, the perfect way for the village to heal, not by forgetting the past, but by quietly building something better atop its lessons. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow stroll through the village. Jutted shop windows were dressed with early signs of the coming winter. Woollens, preserves, advertisements for Guy Fawkes festivities. The churchyard, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, looked peaceful, the graves cloaked in the rich scents of fallen leaves and damp earth. She paused by the rose garden near the vicarage, newly tended and replanted under the careful eye of young volunteers. One rose bush, planted in memory of Leonard Blackwood, had begun to bud, a stubborn late bloom. Miss Marple stood silently for a moment, considering. Blackwood had been a difficult man, pompous and bullying, yet not without his own peculiar kind of pride. His death had been a tragedy, though perhaps, she reflected, the greater tragedy was how easily resentment, fear, and greed had led to murder under the most genteel of circumstances. The rose, defiant against the encroaching cold, seemed a fitting memorial, not sentimental, but true. As she turned for home, a familiar voice called out, "Might I walk you back, Miss Marple?" It was Inspector Cray, his hands thrust deep into his coat pockets against the evening chill. "Of course, Inspector," she said warmly, falling into step beside him. They walked in companionable silence for a time, the village settling into twilight around them. "You know," Cray said at last, "I keep thinking about it. How easy it all seemed once you explained it." Miss Marple chuckled. "That is the nature of truth, Inspector. It fits together naturally, once you have the right pieces." Cray nodded slowly. "And the wrong pieces? They never fit," she said quietly. "No matter how hard one tries to force them," smiled Riley. "You make it sound so simple." Miss Marple paused at her gate, turning to face him. "It is simple in a way. One must simply be willing to see people as they truly are, not as one hopes or fears or expects them to be." She touched his arm lightly. "You have a good mind, Inspector, and a kind heart. That will serve you well." Cray flushed, embarrassed, but pleased. "And you, Miss Marple," he said, "are the sharpest detective I've ever known." She laughed gently. "My dear Inspector, I am merely an old woman who listens and remembers." They said good night then, and Miss Marple watched him stride back down the lane, whistling softly under his breath. A good man, she thought. Mayfair in the dell was fortunate to have him. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and settled into her chair. The autumn night closed in, quiet and familiar. She picked up her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly. Outside, the last rose of summer trembled on its stem, fragile yet enduring against the gathering cold. Much like the village itself, much like human nature. Resilient, flawed, and forever fascinating. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she cast on the first stitches of a new scarf. There would be other mysteries, other puzzles, other small human dramas to observe. And she, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, visitor, listener, quiet guardian, would be ready, always ready,